I want to echo Nathan's words that a series from the Psalms is a brilliant idea. Some of you are laughing because you know why I'm saying that. It was not my idea. It was Sarah's idea. She doesn't ever like me to draw attention to her like that, but I do want to say that she made the suggestion that would be something that might be worth considering and looking into. And my first reaction was, I don't know about that. But the more I thought about it, I think you're onto something. And so it's good to have a good helper, isn't it? It's always good to have someone who can give you good ideas and good suggestions and advice. So she's certainly that for me. And I'm glad to have her here with me this week. We've been looking at various Psalms. There's a statement about the iPhone that people say there's an app for that. Almost like whatever it is you have going on, there's an app for that. You could almost say that about the Psalms. There's a psalm for that. Psalms cover such a wide range of topics and life situations and subjects. And we've already seen a variety. And tonight we'll be looking at a different subject, the subject of in the day of trouble. Life is not always sunshine and rainbows. I don't know, as a kid, it seems like you have this you imagine that adults seem to have everything going for them, and one day you'll just get out and it'll just be wonderful and awesome. And it doesn't take long to figure out that's not really the way life goes. There's sunny days and there's good days, and then there's days when it's overcast and there's days when it rains. There's days that are gloomy, and there's times there's ups and downs, and that's just part of this experience that we have in this life. And there's no way around that. We shouldn't expect it to be any different. It's going to be good days and bad days. We're all going to have those. But for some people, the bad days don't just last for a little afternoon shower. We've had several of those this week. Thinking of the literal weather, where you're driving over this little down, then it's over. Or we stood out there, and when I arrived, I think Sunday, and it wasn't raining, and then it rained a little bit, and then it stopped. And sometimes the ups and downs of life are that way, where things are going well, and then maybe you have a bad day, or maybe even a bad week, and then it goes away, and you're back on things are going good again. But then there seem to be times when the storm lasts longer than that. It's not just a little afternoon shower. It's a prolonged period of despair, a prolonged period of clouds, when the clouds sort of block the sunshine of joy and happiness and good feelings. And some people seem to struggle with that longer and more than others do. It's almost like, the cartoon character. Sometimes somebody's walking around, there's a little cloud hovering above their heads. And sometimes life can feel that way too, where it seems like the sadness or the difficult time is lasting longer than we would hope that it would. And that can be a challenge for us to understand. And I do want to say here right off the bat that, I don't want to discount the role and the blessings and benefit that the medical community can help in some cases. Unfortunately, there's a stigma about mental health in our society that makes people feel ashamed or embarrassed to even talk about it. I take a medicine for blood pressure. We go to the doctor for all kinds of things. And we're blessed to live in a time where there are specialists and counselors and advisors and all kinds of people out there that can help with certain conditions and certain things. And so I'm not an expert in those. I don't really have a lot of knowledge or anything to share about that. What I'm going to focus on tonight is this psalm. But I do want to just say up front that there is a time and a place, I believe, where those things can be helpful as well. But tonight what I want to focus on is the fact that the Bible actually says a lot about this. And of course what I'm talking about is depression. And even though the word depression is not in this psalm, as we read through it together in just a moment, I think you'll agree with me that it describes, at least to a layman's definition, I don't have any medical background to be able to understand exactly what that diagnosis means, but from just a conversational layman's everyday kind of term, I think you'll agree as we read through it that it certainly describes what we would probably call depression if we were trying to describe that. And there's more Bible characters than we might think of that experienced times of despair, that went through difficult times. Sometimes, in our Bible class at home, there's a little chart that shows the kings, and they've got a little face with a little cartoonish looking face. And so it's the kings of Israel and the kings of Jacob, and the good kings have a smile, and the bad kings are frowning. And that's a good way to help the kids learn, which was good and which ones were bad. But it almost gives you the idea in a way, and I mean, it's not the meaning of those little posters, but sometimes we think, well, good people are supposed to be happy all the time. If you're happy and you know it, then your face should really show it. And so if you're doing things the right way, You ought to be smiling all the time. And, you know, the bad guys are the ones that have the frowns on their face. But we see in the Scriptures, you don't have to read very far to find out that very often the good guys had bad days. The good guys had frowns at times. The good guys had moments of despair. In fact, some of these in the Psalms we've looked at already, where people of faith, someone like David and our Lord would say, my God, why have you forsaken me? So would cry out in despair, would wonder where God is and what's going on and why is this happening. Characters such as Jeremiah, Elijah, would really feel down and out and even feel like quitting and giving up. Job would say he was better off dead and wished he was. So righteous, faithful men and women of God have experienced those things. And so we should, again, understand that sometimes life is going to be that way. And we can look to the Scriptures for guidance and for what we can learn from what God says about that. And there's quite a bit. And this psalm in particular, I think, will be helpful as we dive into it. So first, let's just read through Psalm 77, then we'll back up and take it verse by verse. I cry aloud to God, and He will hear me. In the day of trouble I seek the Lord. In the night my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. I'm so troubled I cannot speak. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has His steadfast love forever ceased? Are His promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has He in His anger shut up His compassion? Then I said, I will appeal to this, to the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your works, wonders of old. I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the peoples. You with your arm redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth shook and trembled. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Okay, let's back up now and take this just a section at a time and break it down. The psalm is basically, you could see it in 4 sections. Depending on how your Bible is edited or put together, you might have little paragraph breaks there where you can tell there's 4 big chunks to it. And the pivoting point is in verse 10. So we'll see that when we get to it. As it begins there, the psalmist says in verse 1, I cry aloud to God, and He will hear me. So it begins on saying, I'm going to talk to God about this. That's always the right first step, isn't it? Whatever's going on, whether we're being thankful, whether we're having the best day of our lives, or the worst day of our lives, we should immediately think to ourselves, I need to talk to God about this. So the psalmist is saying, I'm crying aloud to God. And he expresses this faith, and He will hear me. He says that as a fact. James tells us, if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, but that we need to ask in faith. So when we talk to God, we need to have that faith that He is there, that He rewards those who diligently seek Him, as Hebrews 11 says. We need to have that faith that He listens. So the psalmist says, I'm going to cry aloud to God, and I know that He will hear me. So here we're speaking from a perspective of faith. I'm trusting in God that I can talk to Him, and He's going to listen. But I think as we read on, you will see that the faith that he proclaims so steadfastly in verse 1 is immediately challenged and tested. He's going through something that's really putting his faith to the test. He says in verse 2, in the day of my trouble I seek the Lord. He's calling out for help. In the night my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. So he's reaching out, he's praying, and yet his soul can't be satisfied. He's not getting any relief from his distress. His soul refuses to be comforted. The day of trouble has arrived. What is this day of trouble he mentions in verse 2? Well, he doesn't say, and we don't know. It's probably for the best, because it could be anything. There are lots of ways that life can be troubling. Just fill in the blank. There's a bazillion ways that life can be, the day of trouble can arrive. Probably more than a 24-hour period here. The day of trouble could mean, obviously, a particular day, a really bad day. But it can also mean a period of time. Sometimes the word day is used in that way. For instance, notice what the author of Ecclesiastes says, Solomon, in 7:14. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. In the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. This is something like what Job says, shall I accept good from God and not bad? And really we have to take all the days that God gives us. All of them come from God, and the good days come from God, the tough days come from God. And so He's made one and the other as well, and we have to be willing to accept that. The day of trouble is part of life. But the fact that exists, and the fact that even when you have faith in God and you do what He tells you to do, that you still face this day of trouble comes on us sometimes. For many people, that's a real challenge to their faith. It's called the question of evil, or the question of suffering. For some people, it's their number one argument against God. That if there is a God, He's all loving, there wouldn't be this suffering. There wouldn't be hard times. There wouldn't be all these terrible things that happen would never happen. And that's their kind of like number one hang-up. That they refuse to have faith in God because of the fact that we suffer. And so we see quite a few characters in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. Interestingly, you don't see much of this in the New, and that's a whole other topic. But a lot of times in the Old Testament, they will say, like, why is this happening? And usually it's coupled with, and why are those people, the ones who seem to be wicked or not doing the right thing, why do they seem to be blessed? But the man who's trying to do the right thing seems to be going through a hard time. But I look over here at my neighbor, and he seems like everything's going great for him, and he doesn't even care about God. And that, for a lot of people especially in the Old Testament, was a real test of their faith. And they would cry out to God, and they would ask, and they would try to seek some understanding of this. And so the question why is obviously always a difficult question. And I don't know that we're ever going to be able to answer all this. I don't pretend to have the answers. The kids, that's like their faith. Why? And then when you know the hard questions as an adult are still why, right? And they're hard. And I don't know that we can answer them necessarily, but we can still have faith. And that's really what the message, I think, of Job is. He says in verse 3, when I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. Selah. And Selah seems to be, a lot of people aren't sure exactly what that means, from best I can tell, but it's kind of like just a pause in the... That's the best explanation I've heard. But anyway, he says, when I think about God, I moan. Now, moaning, this word means to be in agony. You could moan from grief. You could moan from physical pain. You could moan from, guilt or something else weighing you down. But it's a moan. And it's interesting. He says, when I think about God, I moan. And when I meditate, my spirit faints. When I'm thinking about spiritual things, it's not bringing a relief. In fact, he says, when I think about God, I just moan. And he's struggling, I believe, with his faith. And he goes on to say that in verse 4, you hold my eyelids open. I'm so troubled that I cannot speak. Sometimes even the relief of sleep is hard to find. Many people struggle with difficulty sleeping. And then they're up, and then if you've ever spent a night awake like that, tossing and fall asleep just to wake up again, or you can't go to sleep, it really starts to wear on you after a while. He says, it feels like the Lord, he says, holding my eyelids open. I think he's saying, I can't even find the rest that would normally come from sleep. Job talks about this in Job 7, verse 4. When I lie down, I say, when shall I arise? But the night is long, and I am full of tossing till the dawn. That can make for a long night. If you've experienced that, you know that. And then you wake up the next day and you're still worn out. And the peace and the refreshing that often comes with sleep sometimes leaves us in the day of trouble. And that can make it even more difficult. The blessing and the curse about being wide awake in the middle of the night is you have plenty of time to think. That can be good and that can be bad. Brain, sometimes people just say, they'll say they wish they could just turn their brain off. They're awake and it's like they're just turning. And, they can't quite just settle down and relax so they can go to sleep. And so they're thinking. And And the psalmist here says, so his eyelids are being held open, and he's going to do some thinking in the rest of this. Notice in verse 5, he says, I consider, here's what he's thinking about. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I'm not sure exactly what in the past he's focusing on there. It could be, he goes on talking about things that God had done in the past. But, thinking back on the past could be remembering a time when things were better. It could be remembering things you feel terrible about. There's a lot of ways that, you might try to dwell on the past. That's not necessarily helpful. But he goes on to say in verse 6, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. I think that's interesting. He says, let me remember my song in the night. When Paul and Silas were whipped pretty terribly and thrown in jail, it said that around midnight, the other prisoners were listening. They were singing. On an occasion when you think that'd be the last thing you'd feel like doing, they had a song in the night as they were probably seeking some comfort from God in their affliction and their physical, their backs were all torn up, and their thought was, let's pray and sing some songs. You can never go wrong with songs. And I think it's one of the beautiful blessings of growing up in among God's people, that you have those, this catalog of music, these songs, the lyrics ingrained in you. You can call upon those when you're driving down the road or laying in bed or just thinking. And there's a song for just about every occasion of life as well. When you're feeling happy, when you're feeling sad, when you're being tempted and tried, you can think about, sometimes those songs will come to you, and that can really be a source of comfort. But he's saying here, when I remember my song in the night, I meditate in my heart, and then he begins this diligent search. He's thinking about some things. What's he thinking about? He asks a series of 3, I think, rhetorical questions. Number 7, verse 7. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? This is what he begins thinking. Has God turned on me for good? Well, we know that that's not the case. Look at Psalm 30, verses 4 and 5. David gives us the answer to this. Psalm 30, verses 4 and 5. David says, sing praises to the Lord, O you his saints, and give thanks to his holy name. His anger is but for a moment. His favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes with the morning. So no, the Lord is not going to forever turn his back and forever, leave us in this state of despair and trouble, and the joy will return in the morning. And I think that's a figurative kind of morning. But the good times will come back again. We talked about in Sunday, the Psalm 23, that the Lord makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me to water. But then sometimes the path goes through, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. It's not a destination, but it's sometimes part of the journey. That our path may lead through those periods of shadows and difficulty and fear and the death, hanging over. Sometimes we have to go through that, but the Lord has a place He's bringing us to on the other side of that. And so the answer to this, will the Lord spurn forever and never again be faithful? We would say, no, that's not true. God, I think the psalmist knows that. Verse 8, he says, has His steadfast love forever ceased? Are His promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten? Is He done being merciful? And of course, we know from the Scriptures, like in Lamentations, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. What a wonderful thing. And if you know the setting of that statement, you know it was set in a very dark time. A day of trouble had arrived. And it's one of the saddest books in the Bible. And yet in the middle of it, there's this statement, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come. You don't run out. God doesn't run out of being loving. He doesn't run out. His mercy is like, oh, sorry, I used it all up. That was the last of it. Yesterday I was merciful, and today I'm all out. It's not the way that it works. So we know this is not the case, that His love has run out. Verse 9, has God forgotten to be gracious? Has He has He in anger shut up His compassion? So we can be sure that God doesn't forget to be gracious. And I have a feeling, don't you, that the psalmist knew, even as he was thinking about these things, that the answer to each of these questions was no. But sometimes maybe that helps us to just think it through. To sort of talk through ourselves in terms of, let's just consider this. Has God decided to forevermore turn away? Is He run out of being merciful? Has His grace come to an end? And then we can just answer that question ourselves. No, I know that's not the case. And yet I think sometimes the difficulty of the day of trouble is the sensation that it will perhaps never end. Sometimes people get into a circumstance and they lose hope. And they think it's never going to be good again. It's never going to be right. I'm never going to feel whole. I'm never, maybe they're grieving, or maybe they feel, for whatever reason, they just begin to feel like it's never going to be okay. I think these are these questions. Have I arrived in some dead-end place where the sun is never going to shine again? And that's basically like asking, has God forgotten to be gracious, or His steadfast love run out? And we know the answer to all those questions is no, it's not the case. We just have to make it through this. We have to go through this day of trouble. Now notice that he says in verse 10, I think this is really the turning point. In verse 10, he said, then I said, so this is like a change now. Then I said, I will appeal to the years of the right hand of the Most High. His solution is, he decides he's going to think about something different. So what he had been thinking about was, has God run out of love? Has God run out of grace? Has God decided? Now he said, I'm going to stop. I'm going to think about something else. I decided this. It's like he makes up his mind, I'm going to think about something else. And I think that's really an important point, that we do have some control over what we meditate on. And sometimes I think we can get stuck in a rut of thinking, in sort of a trap of replaying and thinking about and dwelling on things that are not helpful to us and not helpful to coming through this day of trouble. And maybe we have to be like the psalmist here and say, look, I'm going to make up my mind. I'm going to think about something different. I'm going to shift my train of thought now. And what he decides to think about is God's right hand. Now, in Scripture, God's right hand is always whenever God decides to take action. That's with His outstretched arm, His mighty hand. So when God is going to do something, when God is going to take action, and usually He's coming to the aid of His people. And so he says, I'm going to think about God, and I'm going to think about all the things God has done. That's what I'm going to do. That's how maybe you can imagine he's laying there in his bed at night. He's just been thinking about, has God decided to quit ever being, has He decided to stop up, His mercies? But now he says, I'm going to think about what God has done. I'm going to think about some good things about God. Verse 11, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your works of old. This is what I'm going to think about. I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. And now as he's thinking about this, he's made a choice to think about these things. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You see how his mood is almost changing as he's thinking about these? He's shifted his thinking to how awesome God is. You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the peoples. You with your arm redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. So now he's stopped thinking about, has God stopped being merciful? And now he's reminding himself, as he's chosen to dwell on some great things that God has done. And he's thinking about those things, and it's making him now think about how great and awesome God is. When we think along these lines, we can't help but be reminded that we serve an all-powerful God. That no troubles of ours are too big for Him. No day of adversity is too big for God. No difficulty that we're facing is too large for Him. And we can also be reminded that God saves His people. He is active. Of course, that might leave us wondering, well, then where is God in the day of trouble? And in fact, that's usually the question they ask, especially in the Psalms. It's like, I'm crying out to you. Some of them say, I'm hoarse from crying out. I'm fainting. I feel like the waters are coming up to my neck. And where is God? That's usually the question that you find especially in the Old Testament. Where is God in this day of trouble? Even for someone who believes in God, and they say, I have faith and I'm trusting and I'm praying, but I don't know where God is right now because I'm suffering. And so an interesting scene is what he chooses to dwell on next, which I believe is a poetic description of the crossing of the Red Sea. Notice all the way down, I'm just going to skip down, we're going to back up so that you see why I'm saying that. In verse 19 and 20, he says, your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So, I think what follows here in verses 16 through 20 seemed to me to be kind of a poetic description of that crossing of the Red Sea. And there's an interesting thing about that in answer to this question, where is God in the day of trouble? Okay? So if you would, join me, come back with me to Exodus chapter 14. Maybe stick a piece of paper or a marker or something there in Psalm 77. And flip back over to Exodus 14, which is where the crossing of the Red Sea is recorded. Verse 10, beginning. Now, you remember the setting here. Moses had led them out of Egypt. It looked like everything was great. The 10 plagues were already over. The death of the firstborn. The Egyptians say, get out of here. Pharaoh says, get out of here. So they go and they leave. It looks like everything's great. They travel out just a little ways. They come to the sea, and they're kind of camped out there. And then what happens? They turn around, and coming up behind them, Pharaoh changed his mind. Here he comes again. And so that's the setting of what we're about to read. When Pharaoh drew near, verse 10, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. And they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, is it because there's no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in this wilderness. That's almost comical in the way we remember what they were doing was crying out to God to deliver them. But now they're saying, remember, we told you all along we wanted to stay there. But anyway, so they're saying, you've just brought us out here to die. In verse 13, Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. In verse 15 is interesting. It says, the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? There's something in between there. I think that Moses had tried to calm the people down. Then he turns around and sees that he's crying out to God too. Moses says, why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. And of course he tells him to lift his staff, and the waters are going to part. And we know how the story goes from that point on. What's interesting is that I think this is a little detail that perhaps I had missed out on studying through this and just not really paying attention to it. This happens in the middle of the night, this crossing of the Red Sea. I don't know how you pictured it in your mind. I think I'd always pictured my mind in the middle of the day, but this happens at night as this is going on. Look at verses 21, for instance. Moses stretched his hand out over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And then later it says, in the morning they looked, the Lord, in the watch of the morning, the Lord saw that the Egyptians were coming, and he caused their chariots to stumble and those kinds of things. So I think the scene that here is playing out in the middle of the night as they're crossing this through the Red Sea. Now here's another thing that, as a kid, you almost imagine, I don't know how you felt about it as you learned those stories, if you were blessed to grow up being taught all these things from a young age. It's kind of like, it seemed to me like it would almost be fun. You could walk along, it's like, hey, and there's water, over here, and maybe a fish swimming around. But it's like, it almost seemed like a cool thing to try to imagine, that there's these two walls of water, and you're just kind of cruising along, walking through the middle of them all, and like, wow, that would be really neat. I wish I could do that. And it's, it seemed like a happy occasion, but perhaps it was actually extremely frightening and a scary thing to go through, and I suspect that's more closer to the point. Now, let's go back to Psalm 77 and notice this poetic description, which I think is describing this same scene. In Psalm 77, verse 16, when the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water, the skies gave forth thunder, your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind, your lightning shook up the world, and the earth trembled and shook. Now if this is indeed describing that scene, of course, it's adding a lot of detail there that we don't see in Exodus. So it may be that that's something else, but it goes on. The way that it continues is what makes me think that that's what it's talking about. Verse 19, your way was through the sea. The way that God was leading them was through the middle of the sea. Your path through the great waters. Of course, that's what they did. Yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. And that's the end. But what is important here, and what's interesting is, in the middle of this day of trouble, the day of trouble had come on the Israelites, and they felt like it was hopeless. They felt like there was no way out. They thought they were going to be destroyed and wiped out. That's why they were saying, what, did we run out of graves in Egypt? You had to bring us out here to be killed? And Moses said, just trust God. And then God parts the sea and they walk through. But there's a little detail there in verse 19 that I think is very important. He said, yet your footprints were unseen. What does that mean? God was leading the people through the water, and yet his footprints were unseen. But what does that say to you? I think it says he was with them, don't you think? He was with them, but they couldn't see his footprints. In other words, you don't see God walking along ahead of them. You don't see him. They had the fiery pillar by night and the cloud by day. But his footprints were unseen, and yet he was there with his people in the middle going through. He was guiding his people through the day of trouble, kind of like through the valley of the shadow of death. But in this case, it's this watery valley of the shadow of death. And the Lord himself is guiding them by the hand of Aaron and Moses. He's leading his people away to safety. Yet his footprints were unseen. And I think that's really the key detail there, that we can trust that the Lord is with us, even though we don't always see his footprints. So when the question is, where is God on the day of trouble? I would suggest to you the answer is he's right there where he's always been, even though we may not see his footprints. We can trust, just like Moses tried to tell people, just be still and trust, and God will do his thing. And we can trust that God is going to be gracious and merciful and help us in the day of trouble. Let's consider some points in conclusion as we consider this psalm to kind of wrap things up. Number one, we need to just accept it that the day of trouble is part of life. Difficulty is part of this life. I heard an interesting interview on the radio, and we've talked about some of the Amish and Mennonites as we've driven back and forth and talked. And some terrible tragedy had struck an Amish community. I think a man came in and shot up a school or something. Do you remember that story in the news a few years ago? And it's amazing how they respond in those moments. Have you noticed that? I mean, it seemed like everybody kind of remarks on that. And they were interviewing this lady, and she had come from that community, not that particular one, but she had actually gone through some hardships. And they were asking her about kind of their perspective on things and how they seem to view those kind of things differently and react to them differently than a lot of other people do. And she said that it is sort of in their culture that they expect that life is going to be difficult. And that's what they have in their mind. They're like, life is hard. But that they do it together as a community. And so when the day of trouble comes, it's not a big surprise. They understand this is part of life. And we're going to get through it together. And we're going to help each other. And you can sort of see that, I think. Would you agree? You can sort of see that in there. And I think sometimes maybe the American dream, maybe the other flip side of that is, life is supposed to be great. Life is supposed to be fun. Life is supposed to be awesome and happy. And maybe we have, like little kids are encouraged, they daydream, this Cinderella story. We think about, it's going to be, you can be whatever you want to be. And it's going to be, one day you're going to have, it's going to be awesome. And so you kind of grew up with this expectation that, man, life is going to, I just can't wait because it's going to be so great. And then we're sort of setting ourselves up for the reality to come, which is that life is hard. And maybe we don't do a good job of teaching. I don't know. Maybe we don't do a good job of having the right expectation that life is often difficult and has challenges that come upon us. And so we need to be prepared mentally for that. When Jesus described those who obey and those who don't, he says it's like two people building a house. But the storm came on both of them. No, he didn't say, I'm going to show you a way to live where you can avoid the storms. He said, I'm giving you instructions so that when the storm comes, your house doesn't collapse. That's the difference. But whether you follow the Lord or you don't follow the Lord, storms are part of life. And we need to have that kind of expectation in our mind that life can be difficult, and that shouldn't come as a big surprise to us. In fact, we can just look at our Lord and the life that he led, and we see that it was difficult for him. Why should we expect it to be better for us? Secondly, prayer may not be, a quick fix. I think sometimes we know to pray. In fact, the psalm starts on this note that I'm going to call the Lord. In the day of my trouble, I'm calling out to God. So we know that when bad things happen, when something happens, we should pray. And then sometimes we pray, and then we say, well, wait a minute, that didn't really work. I wake up in the morning, the trouble's still here. Okay, I'll pray today. I wake up in the morning, trouble. And it seems like it's not working. We think, well, is the prayer doing what it's supposed to do? Why isn't God listening? And in fact, that's the very question that a lot of the Psalms will ask. I'm crying out to God, and it doesn't seem like he's doing something. And very often when we're told to pray, We pray to God, but that doesn't mean that God's going to immediately change our circumstances. In fact, look over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. This is Paul's thorn in the flesh that he prayed about. And you remember that Paul prayed about this thorn. It was something that was really bothering him. I mean, when you think about that, consider the things that Paul suffered. And suddenly we feel like, well, I don't really suffer at all. That makes me think this, if Paul called it a thorn in the flesh, it must have been pretty bad. And for him to go to God 3 times in prayer about it, it must have been something really bothering him, and to write about it. But notice the answer he gets to his prayer. In verse 8 of 2 Corinthians 12, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul responds, therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. What had he figured out? What did he figure out about prayer here and about how God works in prayer? He said, I prayed to God to take it away. And God said, just like he said to his son, the answer to Paul here was, no, I'm not going to take it away. But what he did say is, I've got enough grace for you. My grace is sufficient. In other words, I'm not taking the difficulty, I'm not taking the pain away, but I'm going to give you what you need to endure it. And in fact, God says, I'll be glorified through that. And Paul says, it's almost like he has a whole new outlook on life. Well, in that case, if he could use my weakness and my suffering for his power to be on display, then I'm okay with it now. It's almost like he has a whole new outlook on life. If God can use my suffering and calamities and hardships and persecutions for his good, then I can be content to suffer through it. Not expecting him to take it away, but trusting that by his grace, I can come through it. And I think that's really the message there. And that maybe that should be our expectation of prayer and how that it works. That what we're praying for is, of course, it's okay to ask for God to take away the problem. But in addition, I think we should pray to God to give us the grace and the strength to go through it. And that may be the answer that we receive more often than not. Thirdly, we see in this point about dwelling on despair, many heroes of faith, Elijah, as I mentioned, Jeremiah, Job, David, had their moments where they really just almost have a breakdown. I think there's no better way to describe it. Where they basically just say, I quit, I don't understand, and they just kind of have a, let's say, come apart, And they're never punished for that, because I think God understands. There's a psalmist that he remembers that we are but flesh. He knows what we're made of. He understands that. But we shouldn't really dwell there. If we have any choice in the matter, we should move out of that. We might have that moment where we just sort of have a little breakdown. And again, to the ability that we have, it should be our goal and our expectation that we would come through that and move on and not get stuck and dwell in that kind of place. And that may be, again, where perhaps seeking some help and some guidance from someone on the outside would be useful for that. But we should expect that the Lord does not want us to stay in that state of mind. That's not a place where he intends for us to live in despair. That doesn't really describe the Christian life. And we shouldn't expect that that's going to be the way it is forever. Fourthly, we should make a conscious effort. I think it's interesting. He said, I was thinking about this. And he was really thinking about some pretty dark thoughts. His thoughts were like, has God forgotten to be gracious? Has God run out of love? Has God turned away forever? Is this going to go on and never get better? I mean, that was kind of the dark thoughts he was having. And then he said, but I decided I will think about this. I will think about good things, God and his mighty works, God and his right hand. I will dwell on it. And he starts thinking about it. And then he starts thinking, God's an awesome God. And then he's remembering how God had been there with his people and what God had done. And finally, he realized that often in the middle of the storm, the Lord's steps are unseen. His footprints are not visible to us. It doesn't mean he's not there. It doesn't mean he's not working, he's not with us, just because we don't see his footsteps. For the last passage that we'll look at tonight, turn with me to 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy 4. In this passage, Paul is writing to Timothy about his first trial when he was on trial in Rome. And notice what he says in verses 16 and 17. At my first defense, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. May it not be charged against them. But the Lord stood by me and strengthened me, and through me the message so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. When Paul stood up there and he's on trial, and he looks to his right hand and to his left, and he felt abandoned, and he felt alone. And the people that he thought he could trust were not there for him. And he said, hopefully the Lord won't hold that against him. He was being merciful to his friends and brothers for not being where they should have been, supporting him in his dark day, in his day of trouble. But he did have this confidence, although I don't think that he could see it with his earthly eyes. By faith, he knew the Lord was there with him and stood by him. And so we can have that same faith that when the day of trouble comes, we may find that our friends let us down, our people aren't where they should be, they don't help like they ought to, they're not where they, but we can trust that the Lord will stand with us in the day of trouble. I hope that's been encouraging to you and helpful to you. I hope it's been something that will help you. If you're not going through that dark day now, it might be coming. And we shouldn't be surprised when it does, and we should look to the Lord for His grace to get us through and trust that He's there with us in the day of trouble. Would you open your songs to the psalm that's been selected for the invitation? This lesson has not been about how to become a Christian. It has not really been that kind of a gospel message about how to become one of God's people. But perhaps there's someone here tonight who wants to do that, and we'd be certainly glad to study with you more about that if that's something you have questions about or you'd like to learn more about. It's the gospel plan is very simple, and the crux of it involves dying and being buried with Him in baptism and raised to walk in newness of life. Perhaps you're ready to make that commitment tonight, or there might be something on your life, on your mind that you want to make right, and would ask for the prayers of the church. If there's any way that we can help you, we'd certainly be glad to do so. If you let us know while we stand and sing.